I have this gorgeous map of Africa from the 18th century. It's the fitting image of a continent virtually unexplored. It isn't so much a map of Africa, but a map of legends arranged in the shape of Africa. It's a delightful melange of myth and rumor, salted with just enough truth to maintain the wonder. Which makes this unusual paragraph here on the map all the more fascinating. I'll translate. Where others have carelessly followed Ludolphus, who has wrongly inserted the source of the Blue Nile into recent maps, we have the authority of the most reverend Heinrich Scherer. We embrace the famous geographer, who from the true reports from the missionaries of his society has given us a diagram of both the white and the blue rivers of the Nile. So, pay no attention to those other maps. Those careless geographers will lead you astray. Only this map shows from whence the Nile rises. When I read something like this, you know that I just can't let it rest until I've checked it out. Let's find out who this Ludolphus was and why he was leading people astray. Welcome to the Eye of History, where maps are our point of entry into the world of history. If you like nerdy dives, scholarly explorations into all sorts of historical topics, always with a unique point of view, then hit the subscribe button and join the adventure. The map was made by Johann Homann, one of the most successful cartographers of the era, and published in his atlas in 1716. This sort of text is rare. I don't have anything else quite like it in my collection, and completely uncharacteristic of the German. So our challenge is to figure out why Homann was so concerned that we don't get swindled by this Ludolphus character, who I've never heard of before as a cartographer. So let's get started. Homann's warnings center on the Nile River, so let's take a look at what was believed at the time to be the longest river in the world. The longest and most mysterious. At the time, the annual Nile floods still begged for a convincing explanation. We start at Cairo, at the head of the Great Delta. We pass by an island that isn't really there. There are two small islands near Cairo. Perhaps this is one of them, a bit misplaced. Further south, we come to another island. This is certainly Elephantine. It's labeled Syene, as the Greeks knew it, a name that shows up in the Bible. It was known to the Greeks for the fact that at noon on the summer solstice, a pole standing straight up will cast no shadow. That small fact was enough to allow Eratosthenes to estimate the size of the Earth remarkably accurately. Homann correctly puts Syene, then, directly on the Tropic of Cancer. So far, he's doing pretty good. And then he loses the plot. Right above Syene, he has a Nubia Fluvium, Cloud River, flowing into the Nile from the southwest. There is just nothing to explain this. There is no such river or anything like it in the real world. Further up, we come to an erroneous island, Meroe, which is a real place, just not an island. Meroe represented the limit of the classical world. Roman legions knocked on the door, so to speak, but never got past the threshold, never conquering these lands. Meroe is bordered by two rivers, but it isn't clear just why the Greeks and Romans thought the two streams formed an island. But the legend led cartographers like Homann to take the real Atbara River and have it meet the Nile above Meroe, then immediately diverge again and loop around to make Meroe an island. Then, above Meroe, he has the river arrive from the southeast, with a large lake at its headwaters. He calls it the Abambus Fluvium. Unfortunately, there is no large lake feeding it in real life. And it just gets worse from here. A little higher up, we see the city of Sova. Definitely a real place, but by latitude, it should be about 500 miles further north, but by its position he gives it on the Nile, it should be about 500 miles further south. And from here on, there's really no point even trying to compare the map with the real world. The map shows the Nile reaching deep into the south, roughly to modern Zambia, with two huge lakes at its headwaters. There are some Great Lakes in that area, Tanganyika and Nyassa, but neither touch the Nile in any way. How did Homann go so terribly wrong? He wasn't alone. Almost every map of Africa made before 1700 was similar. Almost all of this was the legacy of Claudius Ptolemaeus, the 2nd century author of the Geographia, the ultimate handbook of cartography. If we compare Homann's map with a map constructed explicitly using Ptolemy's 1,000-year-old instructions, we see all the main elements. We see the island of Meroe and the Great Lakes as the Nile's source. The Abonbus Fluvium is the River of Sobriety in the older map. The main difference between the two maps is merely that Homann's map has added an incredible amount of additional detail. In the 200 years between these two maps, cartographers, including Homann, just kept shoehorning any new information they received into Ptolemy's map. Some of the new information was mistaken, like the Cloud River we found, but much of what was added was good. Until, of course, it got mixed into the antiquated Ptolemaic mess. For example, there really was a place called Dambia and a place called Ambian Cantiva, just not anywhere near where Homann placed them. I traced these two places back as far as I could. Ambian Cantiva started showing up about a century before this map was made, 1623 or so, in a map from the Dutch cartographer Jodocus Hondius. As for Dambia, as far as I can tell, this is the first map to show it. It's interesting, then, that Homann would trumpet that he was consulting the most Reverend Heinrich Scherer as his authority. Scherer was also a cartographer, working at the same time as Homann, something of a rival, actually. He was also professor of Hebrew, ethics, and mathematics, an academic overachiever for sure. But more importantly for this story, he was a Jesuit, and had ties to the many Jesuit missionaries that had fanned out over the world. Scherer's maps drew heavily on information he gleaned from these missionaries, particularly in Asia, and the atlas he produced had a decidedly Catholic bent. It made sense for Homann to refer to Scherer as a particularly good authority. The Jesuits were the most respected explorers of the era. Even Protestants would be impressed by a map with Jesuit roots. It's just unfortunate that the particular Jesuits that Scherer was in contact with clearly weren't the ones exploring Africa. None of Scherer's maps were particularly groundbreaking, but his map of Africa was an even greater mess than Homann's. So why did Homann feel the need to invoke Scherer's name in defense of his map? It's pretty simple, really. The original version of Homann's map did not have the warning about Ludolfus and the reference to Scherer. At the time he published it, he had reason to feel pretty good about the map. It is, objectively, packed with more place names than pretty much any other map of Africa at the time. It was just one map in an excellent atlas, a premium product, as you can tell by the cartouches and their outstanding engraving. But apparently, sometime after the atlas was released, Homann began hearing from the booksellers that the Africa map, as beautiful as it was costing him sales. People were hearing about this Ludolfus character and wanted to know more. Creating a whole new map would have been an expensive undertaking and might take a year or more. Adding the warning, however, was a cheap and easy answer. And Scherer, as mediocre as he really was the most plausible authority Homann could find. It apparently worked well enough. Homann's heirs kept printing the atlas, with this map unchanged, for another 40 years. So who was this Ludolfus character? And why is he out there seducing the vulnerable with his radical ideas? Hiob Ludolf was a German scholar, not a cartographer, but a philologist, a lover of language, what we would call today a linguist. And he was pretty good at it. He was familiar with at least 24 languages. But his career really took off due to a fortunate meeting he had when he was 25 years old. The Swedish embassy had hired the young polyglot to go to Rome to dig up certain documents. While he was there, Young Hiob satisfied his thirst for languages by befriending an Ethiopian monk, Abba Gorgoryos. Over the next 9 years, the two men collaborated on two of the most important texts in the history of philology and the European understanding of Africa. And those texts made Ludolf a superstar among Europe's intelligentsia. It helped here that Gorgoryos was a pretty bright guy himself. He had been a scholar in the Ethiopian church before meeting Jesuit missionaries, and after converting to Catholicism, he became the secretary to the Jesuit leader, Pedro Paez, the first European to ever view the source of the Blue Nile, and the author of his History of Ethiopia that sat unpublished for nearly 300 years. When the Ethiopian emperor expelled the Catholics in 1632, Gorgoryos became a refugee and made his way to Rome. The first book the two men made together was an Ethiopian Latin lexicon. It weighed in at over 400 pages, and it made Ludolf a linguistic celebrity. He did more to increase his fame. It was Ludolf, along with Edward Bernard and the great Wilhelm Leibniz, who first realized that German, Latin, and Greek were all members of a language family, with the Slavic languages as close cousins. They called these languages Japhetic, a name appropriated from the Bible. Today, we add Sanskrit to the family and call them Indo-European. The second book that Gorgoryos and Ludolf wrote was a description of Ethiopia, another 400-page tome. What concerns us most here are Section 1, Chapter 4, quote, of the vulgar chorographic table or map of Abyssinia and the author's new one. By vulgar map, Ludolf meant all the other maps of the time. He doesn't identify a particular author, nor would it matter much if he chose a particular one to ridicule. When he showed such a map to Gorgoryos, he says, sometimes I made him laugh, sometimes I made him angry. Remember Ambien Cantiva? Gorgoryos laughed outright when Ludolf showed him that one. It took Gorgoryos a moment to figure it out. Ambien Cantiva was a mashup of Dembia and Cantiba, which would mean governor of Dembia. So Homann's map has as two separate places both the province of Dembia and Ambien Cantiva, Dembia's governor. Ludolf gives several other examples of the same type of mistake, titles getting mixed into place names. Another source of mischief came from the tendency for the Portuguese Jesuits to replace initial A's with trailing O's. So Axum becomes Casumo, or on Homann's map, Chaxumo. The error here was well meant. The vowels here were both declensions, marking these words as nominatives. The mistake is sort of like translating Williamsport as Port William. Unfortunately, as cartographers combine information from different sources, often both names sneaked into the map in slightly different places. And finally, transliterating names from language to language is always fraught with problems. When I was young, according to every map made in America, the capital of China was Peking. Today it's called Beijing. I am sure that there are people in my generation who think that these were two different cities and wonder why the capital of China got moved. Fortunately, few of those people are cartographers. So Ludolf and Gorgoryos set to creating a new map. Ludolf's plan was to just take one of the existing maps and just replace all the erroneous place names with Gorgoryos' corrections. But the result was barely any better than the original maps that he criticized so harshly in the beginning, and he consigned that map to the trash bin. So how then did he come up with this map? As you can see, what Ludolf ended up publishing looks nothing like anything else we've seen before. Ludolf's Blue Nile does spring from a large lake, but that lake sits at about 13 degrees north latitude. Homann's lake is at about 8 degrees latitude south. And there's really no other feature that you can compare. You could not guess that these two maps were meant to depict the same place. So how did Ludolf and Gorgoryos make this? Ludolf gives all the credit to yet another Jesuit, Balthazar Tellez. Tellez was a professor in Portugal and a very successful author. Among his works was a history of the Jesuit mission in Ethiopia, which included a map based on what Tellez found in the Jesuit archives. As you can see, this map has the source of the Nile, it's called Lake Tana today, at about 14 degrees north latitude, almost the same as Ludolf and Gorgoryos' map. So that solves the mystery, and ironically, where Homann tried to imply that his map was based on Jesuit wisdom, it was actually Ludolf who was working from Jesuit sources. But if we compare the two maps, we can see that Ludolf actually understates what he and Gorgoryos accomplished, because although Ludolf's map is very similar to Tellez's version, Ludolf's map is much more detailed and contains some major corrections. It's most obvious in the shape of the lake, but you can also see it in the courses of the rivers. Some of it is mere embellishment, but clearly Gorgoryos did much more than just fix the place names. Now, neither of these two maps should have been of much consequence to Homann. They were both hidden away in history books, and Homann was an atlas maker. It wasn't these two maps, but this one that forced Homann to address the problem. This map is one of the prides of my collection. I take a lot of satisfaction from having both Homann's map and the map he despised. And I mean it when I say Homann despised it, because this map was made to ridicule maps like Homann's. The map came from the workshop of one of the greatest cartographers and atlas publishers of all time, Vincenzo Coronelli. Another churchman, and the only one in this video who wasn't a Jesuit. Coronelli was a figure that Homann could not ignore. He was a renowned astronomer, mathematician, and theologian, plus the international head of his religious order, founder of the first geographical society, and Italy's greatest cartographer. Today, he is most famous for the globes he made for France's King Louis XIV, 15-foot baubles intended to adorn Versailles, and attention-grabbing museum pieces today. But he had a long and illustrious career, both as a churchman and as the pride of Italy's cartographic community. Coronelli's map is very closely based on Ludolf's, but it isn't identical. Coronelli includes every place name that Ludolf had, as far as I can tell, but adds just a few more. Some of the river courses have been adjusted, some islands added to the coastline, but mostly Coronelli cleaned up the original, making it infinitely easier to read. The Coronelli map is beautifully engraved and is simply one of the most gorgeous maps in my collection. But what put it in Homann's crosshairs was this little inset, a map that looks very much like Homann's. It's not identical, but it's close enough, and it's captioned Descripto secondo la osservazione dei passati geografi. Described according to the observation of past geographers. And I believe the emphasis is on the word passati, a word that carries the sense of passé. There is no doubt that Coronelli considered Homann passato. So the plot is now clear. We have two rivals. Representing Germany, the last defender of Ptolemy, we have Johann Homann. Representing Italy and the novel achievements of the Jesuit missionaries, Vincenzo Coronelli. It was Coronelli that took the first shot, a broadside, a direct comparison of the Ptolemaic description of the Nile with his own map, based on the reports of Jesuit missionaries and the Ethiopian cleric Abba Gorgoryos. Homann responded with a damp squib, a feeble reference to one of his peers, Heinrich Scherer, who had nothing new to contribute to the battle. Homann was sunk. His was the last map I could find that followed the Ptolemaic scheme. The question we must ask, though, is whether these maps were actually accurate. Homann's, of course, is worthless. Coronelli's, however, is pretty good. It tends to fail at the margins. That should be no surprise. But after close inspection, I would say this map from 1690 is not much behind this map from 1832, a map from the highly esteemed John Arrowsmith. And for a map from 1690, it is considerably better than any map of Japan printed at that time. So for Coronelli, it was a flawless victory. His decision to include the inset with the Passato Nile was a masterstroke that cemented his reputation. Today, anything by Coronelli is highly prized by collectors. Some of his most desirable maps sell for over $10,000, an incredible sum for atlas maps. Homann's maps are very collectible as well, but not at near the same prices. Except, ironically, for this one. For in the collecting world, infamy sells even better than fame deserved. As much as collectors admire Coronelli's superior scholarship, they salivate over Homann's errors and the ham-handed way he dealt with it. My ridiculous Homann map is worth about half again what my excellent Coronelli is. Somehow, it doesn't seem fair. If you enjoyed this little investigation, remember to hit the like button. It's how YouTube learns that you and I are the same sort of nerds. And if you want to see more of this sort of content, then subscribe, and we'll keep sending you more.